Hello everyone, this is MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. In this video I'm going to cover how to study with PioSolver. Now it's extremely important to know how to study effectively with the solver, because not only will you be wasting a lot of time if you don't know how to do it properly, but you may even teach yourself stuff which is not correct and make your game worse. Of course, we start with preflop. Now you have to spend some time on your ranges being exact. If your preflop ranges are not correct, your postflop outputs will also be incorrect. So make sure to study them in detail and save them for the future. I'll show you how to do that. So here you see a Pio sim. I've selected a certain preflop range, and I then save them right here. So I've input both ranges, all the sizes, etc. And then I click on save parameters, name it, for instance, button big blind. And then when you want to solve another button big blind sim, you can just open these parameters and change the board texture. The preflop ranges can be found in our Bluff the Spot Preflop Bible. You can also use different types of solvers that have preflop solutions. We use our own Bluff the Spot ranges because we think they are a little bit better than the solver's ranges, because the solver is set up with a couple of assumptions which we don't think are perfect, and also because humans don't play the same as solvers. So even if those ranges were absolutely perfect, we don't play like solvers, and neither do our opponents. And you have to make sure to deviate from those ranges, especially when you play lower stakes, where people play much different preflop strategies than at higher stakes. So the lower you play, the more you have to deviate your ranges. So the first step to studying is the discovery phase. Let's say we know very little about a certain spot. The hand example I'm going to use is King 4-3 Rainbow, button big blind, a very simple spot to start with. So let's say we have no idea what the solver is going to do. We're going to solve a very large tree to find out which sizes the solver likes to use. Here I've pulled up the sim in question, King 4-3 Rainbow. I'm checking 100% of the time. I would recommend that you guys do not add donk bets. Not only would I not recommend them for you in game, but your opponents usually don't donk bet either, so it would just make the tree less accurate. So we've checked 100% and we get this output. So you see 1.3% 3/4 pot bet, the pot size is 60, and we allowed it to bet 45, 30, 18, or check. So it almost never bets big, it almost never bets small, and it almost never checks. So when you see this output, what you can do is simplify your strategy. You can run this simulation again, but take out some parts of the tree and then compare the EV difference. So you can see right here, if you click on imposition EV, our EV is 40.741 out of 60. So we have over 2/3 of the EV. So you can run the sim again and then check the EV difference. And if the EV difference is very minimal, it's not worth considering these other sizes. Because if you, let's say, remove the check back range, you don't have to worry about what happens after you check back the flop. So you keep your strategy simple, and at the same time, you're not giving up too much EV. This, of course, is a very clear example of a board on which you can simplify. We're also going to go into a board where that would be not as simple. So once I allow Pio to only bet 1/3 pot, you see it still bets around 95% of the time. So it's important to keep on rerunning the tree. So we solved a very large tree. Now we made the tree a bit smaller by only allowing it to bet 1/3 pot. And you see that it still almost only bets 1/3 pot and barely checks. So we run it one more time, but then run it with a forced range bet, which is this sim. You see, I'm forcing it to bet 18 into 60, a little bit under 1/3 pot. And so this sim is going to be the most accurate, because if you allow the solver to bet big, it's gonna mostly bet its good hands for a big sizing, which means that the smaller bet size is weaker and therefore out of position would check raise way more aggressively against the mixed strategy than if you bet your full range 1/3 pot. So the mistake you could be making is writing down, okay, Pio check raises 20% in this spot, where in reality it would check raise less because you've now included all of its strong hands. Keep on making the tree smaller and smaller. I showed you how to do it on the flop. I would only recommend using one sizing on the flop. On the turn and the river, we use many sizes and then run the tree once again until you've used a maximum of 2 sizes on the turn, and I recommend 3 on the river, but if possible, just use 2. The smaller the tree, the more accurate. Remember that, guys. Now I'm going to show you a board on which simplifying and betting 1/3 pot with your full range would not work. The EV difference would be significant. This is a board on which simplifying and betting 1/3 pot with your full range would not work. So 10-9-4 flush draw is completely different than King 4-3 rainbow. On King 4-3, if you have a king, you can almost never be behind. Or your opponent's hand is so good that you can almost not win anymore. On 10-9-4, there's a lot more hands in either's range which have good equity against each other. So out of position on this board is going to have a ton of 10s to defend the big blind, a ton of 9s, a few 4s, tons of hands like King Queen, King Jack, Jack 8, 8-7, 8-6, Jack 7, flush draws, good ace highs. It's very difficult for villain to have absolutely nothing. And there's a lot of turns and rivers that change the board. So on those types of boards, we tend to bet bigger. Our range is pretty strong, but so is our opponent's, so we want to charge him. So what you see on 10-9-4, I've allowed it to bet 1/3 pot, half pot, 3/4 pot, and even overbet the flop. And you see that the overbet is really the only sizing it uses. That's pretty interesting. I bet that a lot of you would not have guessed that. That's why it's important to use many different sizes so you don't miss any of that. I would say that using 3/4 pot or full pot rather than overbet is not hugely significant, but betting 1/3 pot with your full range is. As you can see, it only bets 1/3 pot 2.6% of the time. We also have to account for people's mistakes. Let's say out of position never check raises, which is a significant mistake. Let's see what happens then. So I solved 10-9-4 with no check raise as well. And not check raising is not even realistic because even people who under check raise the flop don't check raise 0% of the time. So when villain never raises, you see Pio Solver starts betting way more often. I mean, it checked in the 40s in the other sim. Here it bets full range basically. But you see that the overbet is still more dominant than the 1/3 pot bet. So imagine if people just under check raise. You can do that with note locks. You can study and use your opponent's strategies against them. So you can input, let's say, 8% check raise on a certain board rather than 20, and even pick the exact hands you think your opponents are check raising. You have to be careful with your assumptions though. So you see, against no check raise range, we still mostly overbet the flop. So betting 1/3 pot against somebody who doesn't check raise is still not a viable strategy. Going back to the original sim, now again it's time to simplify. You see that these sizes are almost never being used, so we're going to throw them out. We're going to run the sim again and then study it. So I've run the sim one more time, one sizing now. To keep it simple, I've only allowed Pio Solver to bet full pot, and you see it still checks a little bit over 40% of the time. And now is when we start studying. So just to recap, while improving accuracy, remove parts of the tree that are not used often and use a maximum of 1 sizing on the flop, 2 on the turn. I prefer 2 on the river, but you could use 3. The river accuracy is less important than the flop accuracy, because if the flop is off, the river will be way off. The smaller the tree, the more accurate. And you can use a pure strategy if the EV loss is minimal, generally under 1% difference. And then you keep on improving the tree until it's become very simple. And that's a tree we study with. So let's actually study this sim for a bit. What do we see? You will find different types of tendencies, and it's important to note those because you'll see that they happen in basically every single scenario. Once you learn how PioSolver thinks, you can predict what it will do in future hands. So let's look. What do we see here? Something very simple. Top kicker gets bet basically every time, and the weaker a kicker, the less we bet. And you see right here, other than a set or two pair obviously, the weaker the kicker, the less it bets. And you'll see this in many different spots. So you can conclude, okay, with a strong kicker, we bet more often than with a weak kicker. Now, that is nothing groundbreaking, I know. So let's look into something a little bit more detailed. If we have a check back range, it means we should check back some flush draws as well. So which flush draws does Pio like to check back in these spots? Let's look at ace-high flush draws first. You'll see a hand like ace-5 of diamonds gets bet 95% of the time. So you could just always bet that. But then if we look at a hand like ace-king of diamonds, you'll see it actually checks back more often than it bets. That's surprising because ace-king of diamonds has more EV in a vacuum than ace-5 of diamonds. The reason is that ace-king has much better showdown value than ace-5. It beats all the medium aces, and if you hit a king on later streets, you have the best hand almost always. Whereas on the 5, you have the best hand much less often. So winning the pot outright is way more important with ace-5 than with ace-king. With ace-king of diamonds, we also block the second nut flush, which we're going to cooler. We're going to win their entire stack usually. And of course, you want to have some ace-high flush draws in your check back range so that your opponent cannot just go overbet and then shove the river on a flush runout. You have to be able to withstand some heat. So you see, when you have, let's say, ace-queen of diamonds, see, it still bets a lot now, but less often than ace-5 of diamonds. Ace-jack, same story. 85% bet, 15% check. We also see that, for instance, a hand like 7-5 of diamonds gets checked back a decent amount. So we have two weak backdoor straight draws and we have a weak flush draw. So you see that Pio in this spot prefers to check back weaker flush draws and prefers to bet at stronger ones. That also makes sense intuitively, right? You want to generally bet your stronger hands more often than your weak hands. Another thing. Pocket 4s always gets bet. Pocket 9s always gets bet, but pocket 10s gets checked sometimes. So you see we can check top sets sometimes. The reason is that we block two 10s, which are potentially going to call us down for 3 streets. You also see that Pio likes to bet its bigger draws first. So you see queen jack of diamonds gets bet basically always, but queen jack without diamonds gets bet less often. So you have to mix it up everywhere. You'll see a hand like 8-6 suited still gets bet a decent amount, but less often. So strong draws get bet more often than weak draws. This all intuitively makes sense, but it's important to write that down. And once you see this stuff happening in many different sims, you can predict what the solver will do in a spot that you haven't studied. Let's be honest, when we're playing, we haven't studied most spots. So if you know how the solver thinks, you can play like the solver without having to sim every single hand. Okay, let's go to the turn, see what happens. So we're betting, full pot. And PioSolver obviously folds a lot because we're getting a bad price out of position. And we're not check raising very often. That makes sense. Now, if on a lot of boards you see that when you bet polarized, it check raises very little, you can write down against a large and polarized bet, we don't check raise often. That also makes sense intuitively, right? And then when you look at out of positions play, you'll see it plays intuitively once again. You see it check raises mostly with its strong hands, but still check calls them sometimes. So 10-9, for instance, top 2 pair, almost never loses, but it still gets check called quite often because our range doesn't want to check raise much in general. And you'll see that, for instance, a hand like ace-3 of diamonds gets check raised around 26%, but a hand like jack-3 only around 8%. So you'll see once again that strong flush draws get check raised more often than weak flush draws. Or that top pair good kicker gets raised a little bit more often than top pair medium kicker. All of these things keep coming back. So we've bet a polarized range, we folded a lot, we go to the turn. Let's say the turn is safe, like a 3. Check, check, or a single check. And you see that Pio likes to bet big. Because we've bet a polarized range on the flop, it still wants to bet big on the 3. Because which really strong hand now wants to slow down on the 3? The 3 is not scary at all. Unless a villain has specifically 4-3 suited, it doesn't improve his range at all. So we keep on betting big. But if you were to pick the 8 of diamonds, you'll see that all of a sudden Pio likes to bet really small, as well as just a regular large sizing. But it doesn't really overbet, because on the 8, villain can have 2 pair, he can have a straight, he can have a set, he can have a pair plus draw. It's a scary card, which means we bet less in general. So we've overbet the turn, and we get called, and then you'll see on, let's say, the safest possible card, it only overbets. Because if you bet a really strong hand on the turn, why would you not get max value on the river? The 3 again doesn't change anything. Villain would have to have 3x plus diamonds basically, or 4-3 suited, which is one combination. Now if we let it call and the turn, now if we let it call the flop and then the turn is 8 of diamonds, as you saw, we bet larger. And then let's say the river is a 5. That's a card on which we can use multiple sizes. So it would also like a large bet a decent amount. If we pick a safer card, a deuce, you see it now shoves much more aggressively. So you see the safer the card, the more aggressive it is. If you look for these patterns, you'll be able to study very, very effectively. Let's go back to the King 4-3 board. So on King 4-3, we've bet our full range, and you see Pio solver check raises a decent amount. So let's look at the check raising range and learn a bit from that. So you see once again, top pair good kicker gets check raised quite often, and then the worse the kicker, the less often you check raise. You see that, for instance, strong draws like 6-5 suited always get raised, and then decent draws like, let's say, ace deuce get check raised a bit less often. You'll see that good ace highs always get check called, but then the weaker ones sometimes get folded or raised. 2 pair almost always gets raised, or well, it always gets raised, as well as sets. So all of this stuff is fairly intuitive. So we call, and then on the, let's say the 10 of diamonds, my prediction is that it's going to bet very large with a polarized range, because we've checked back a lot on the turn, we're going to check back a lot on the turn, and then the hands that do want to bet want to get max value on the 10. The 10 is not a scary card. So let's see. So you see that the overbet is pretty dominant, as well as a large bet, and you see that the small bet never gets used, because which hand would you really like to bet small for this sizing? A 4 or a 3? Not really. Maybe some 10s, but you see that doesn't really make sense. Now if we pick something like the 6 of diamonds, we're still betting somewhat often, but you see that the sizing is much less dominant. We're kind of mixing sizes at this point, in which case I would use only one sizing for your strategy. Here it's kind of difficult to figure out, but this is rare. Usually you'll see that one sizing is dominant, or maybe 2. Let's go back to the 10 example. Check. We overbet. So here we should run the tree again and remove the bet size of 72 to make the overbet more accurate, and also the rest of the sim. Call, and let's say we pick the 3. I predict it's gonna be extremely aggressive. And you see that Pio actually shoves for 2.5 times the pot extremely aggressively. but then if you pick a card which is less good for you, you'll see that it usually uses the fairly large sizing. So all pretty interesting stuff, but you see that it's always consistent. So the third step, once we've improved Sim's accuracy, is to categorize boards. You can find similar tendencies on many boards, as we talked about, and study all boards at once if you know which ones are played similarly. So 10-9-4 and King 4-3 are of course completely different, but 10-9-4 is similar to 9-8-4 or Jack 9-4, let's say, and King 4-3 is similar to, let's say, Ace A6 or Jack 3 Deuce. Once you've categorized boards, that's when you can use a script. To set up a script, you just fill in your parameters and click Generate Script. Here's where you enter your flops. You can find those on the PioSolver website. You set the accuracy to 0.5%. You can make it more accurate, but 0.5% is the minimum. You can potentially have your computer take a break if you are afraid it will overheat. You click on small saves. It's not necessary to use a full save because one sim is approximately 2 gigabytes, depending on the spot you save. You find a file to save your sims in, you give it a name, and you click Generate Script. This window should be filled. Once I input the correct information, you click on Script, and you run the script. You'll see a black box that will give you information on the script. Oftentimes, these scripts take an extremely long time, and you can just close them and then open them again later. How you do that is you go to Tools, and here you click Load Script, and then you just open the file in the correct folder. So we can make a folder called, let's say, Button Big Blind Dry Boards Script, and then you find the script file and you click on it, and it will carry on where it left off. You can also use note locks, which I think I should not cover in this video because it's extremely specific, and if you do it wrong, you'll make big mistakes. So you have to mostly remember to be very careful with your assumptions. So I would look at Pio's output and then change it a little bit, but not change it too drastically. The fourth step is starting to draw conclusions. Once you've perfected your output, that's when you start learning. So don't make the mistake of learning from the original tree. And then you can use a knowledge file to write down your findings. The fifth step is to actually organize your findings by creating that knowledge file. I'm gonna just show you how to do that in this presentation. The conclusions have to be short and to the point. So don't write stories you will never read again. Similar to taking notes, if you write a story and you only have a few seconds in game, you will never check those notes, let's be real. So we have to just write very quick conclusions. So this is what a knowledge file would look like. You can use Word or a text file, whatever you like. So first we're gonna name the category. For instance, button big blind single raise pot, early position big blind, 3-bet pots, etc. For this example, let's use button big blind because that's what we've been looking at so far. So I just write down button big blind, and now I'm going to only write about button big blind. So we can write stuff about c-betting dry flops, and then you input your information. C-betting wet boards, write down your information, and then let's say check raising the flop. And we have many different topics. So if you're unsure about a hand, just go to your file, look at the specific area of your file in which you've written down what you want to know about, and then you instantly have your information. An example, check raise big with a polarized range on boards that are good for imposition. That's something that I found through Pio. Or you saw, for instance, c-bet more often with top pair good kicker than top pair bad kicker. Very simple stuff like that. You can make it even shorter than that if you like. So organize everything and make sure it's to the point. Don't write any stories that you'll never read again. And then the final step, arguably the most important step, is to repeat what you've learned. Most of you guys listening are already extremely good at poker. what you see in solver outputs will often not be groundbreaking. You already kind of know what to do, you're just sharpening your skills. And then once you haven't studied for a little bit, it's easy to forget what you learned. So keep on reviewing your work. Oftentimes it's just about getting that little push in the back, getting that little bit of extra confidence in order to really boost your game and get that little bit extra win rate that you're looking for. Some final tips. No output is perfect. Take everything with a grain of salt. Again, these are outputs made by us. They're extremely good, but they're not perfect. So don't assume that everything you see is perfect. And even if it were, humans do not play like this. So make sure to trust your intuition. If you see something which is off, it likely is. If you see that the solver suggests opening 7 deuce under the gun, this is likely just a mistake made by you. So make sure to check everything, and most likely you'll find the mistake. If you, even in a more delicate spot, if you see something that makes no sense, oftentimes you made a mistake. You are a very good poker player. Trust your intuition. Third point I just mentioned, humans do not play like solvers, so don't try and copy solvers. If you play like Pio, you'll make a lot of money. But the goal is not playing like Pio. The goal is just to make money. And adjusting to your opponents is oftentimes just as important. So you can know everything there's to know about Pio Solver. It doesn't necessarily mean you are the quote-unquote perfect player. Well, that was the last slide. With this video, I think it's important that you replay it a few times and make notes and set up a studying plan, because you're not going to learn any of this right away. So being organized is so important. I hope you all learned something from this video. This was MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot High 6 course. Good luck.